Hello and welcome, everybody. Today on the podcast is a very special interview as I am honored and privileged to have a discussion with a man who has done so much for science and public health over the past 40 years. As a medical doctor, he has become an international expert in sports medicine, an eminent scientific researcher with more than 750 scientific publications and, of course, an author of many books. Now, retired from the academia, he's still very active in the promotion of a low carb lifestyle by being the founder and director of the Noakes Foundation, the Nutrition Network, and Eat Better South Africa. So, I will not keep you waiting any longer, and I hope you guys will enjoy this amazing interview with Prof. Tim Noakes. Prof. Noakes, welcome on the podcast and thank you so much for making this happening.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to the next hour or so.
So, before we start this interview, I'd like to tell you my deep appreciation as both your work and your ethics have had an immense impact on my life as a next endurance competitive athlete when I was becoming a pre-diabetic man at age 35. So, thanks to your work and studying with the Nutrition Network, you and your team helped me to understand what I was going through and manage to get out of it. And on the other hand, seeing the integrity and ethics you showed when you were publicly attacked have inspired me a lot to change the way I now practice my job. So, Prof. Noakes, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I was able to help you in some way, some small way. But
And I'm sure,
congratulations for making the changes. It's difficult, to go against the grain. It's difficult.
yeah, but I'm sure you inspired more than one person in the world.
Thank you.
So we'll start this interview with this. May I ask you to introduce yourself so people who may not know you would understand why we will be speaking about sports medicine, performance, and nutrition.
Yeah, indeed. So I studied medicine, but it was clear to me that I was more interested in the science. And I became interested in endurance sports at the same time. So while I was studying medicine, I was actually looking at the medical applications to sport. And so that's where I went. Instead of going into medical practice, I went into science. And I spent the next 40 years or so, fortunately, starting sports science in South Africa. And was very fortunate to be running at the time and doing ultra marathons. And it was at the time when marathon running was just becoming a global phenomenon. Before that, when I first started, it was a very small sport. But by the time I finished running, it had become a major event around the world. And to have been part of that was great. And the second thing was that sports science became a major science, whereas before it was minor. But then a couple of things happened. And the most important thing was Nike running shoes, because people don't actually understand this. But when Phil Knight started making Nike shoes, he didn't have anyone to sell them to because there were no runners. So he had to make sure that there were runners. And what he did was he identified the 2 or 3 great runners in the world and funded them so that they could continue to run. Of course, the funding was illegal because it was an amateur sport. But then eventually those athletes became so well known and they inspired the running revolution. that produced professional running, and that produced professional sport in the Olympic Games. And because there was now professional sport in the Olympic Games, people wanted to know about the science of sport, and that produced the career that I was fortunate enough to study. So that's how it came. All to Phil Knight and the Nike running shoes really made a massive change to sport in the world.
Uh-huh. So you've been in the academia for 40 years, 50 years?
Yeah, since 1976. Well, actually, even before, because I studied medicine 69 to 74, and then I went into research 76. So
Okay.
that would be the 40th year. Sorry, the 50th year. It's even worse. It'll be the 50th year next year.
Okay, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So, from a personal and scientific point of view, how did you realize that the carbo-loading theory, we go straight into the topic.
Yeah.
So, how did you realize that the carbo-loading theory used for athletes that you and your colleagues defended and promoted at the time during many years was at some point, can we say, wrong?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I, like yourself, am insulin resistant. And so I developed type 2 diabetes. But before I even knew that I had type 2 diabetes, I happened to read a book called The New Atkins for the New You. And it spoke about the low carb diet. And I knew the three authors. And I thought, these people have sold out to Atkins. And that's terrible. And I was so angry. I went and bought the book and read it. And 3 hours later, I said, gosh, I was wrong for 33 years as it was then. And I decided I better try it. And I just felt so much better. And my running improved dramatically. I went back 20 years. I started running as I had 20 years before. So then I had to realize that the diet I'd been following had impaired my running. It hadn't helped, that it impaired it. And so that was when I made the shift and slowly started doing the research more recently. But firstly, it was just observing myself and observing other athletes and seeing that there was no logic to the high carbohydrate diet. But only in the last, I guess, year have we actually been able to show convincingly, absolutely without doubt, that you don't need these high carbohydrate diets to perform. Unfortunately, we're up against industry once more because the previous time was on the over drinking. Now it's over carbing, which is the problem. And so it's going to take a long time before it changes. And particularly, we've got the Tour de France, and every day you hear these guys are taking 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour during the tour, and that's why they're going so fast. That's nonsense.
If only it was.
If they're going faster, there's something else involved, but it's not the carbs.
Yes. So how is it after 33 years of academia and research and being a professor and thinking, well, I was wrong? How is it easy to, I guess it's a personal also attitude, but how did you manage that kind of wake-up call?
You ask a really good question, because I was kind of forced into it. So then I was very quiet about it because I was being funded by the industry. And the health industry. And I was being funded to say that carbs are good and grains are good and sugar's good and all that sort of nonsense, and ultra processed foods are good. I wasn't being paid to say it, but I wasn't allowed to say the opposite. That's what happened. And then when I dropped it, I lost all my funding. So that was quite easy. And then I got charged with promoting this dietary misinformation. So then I had to spend the next 4 years actually looking at nutrition and health. And then it was very clear that the high carbohydrate diets are a disaster for people like myself who are insulin resistant. So that's what I first learned. It was the medical side. It wasn't the performance side. And then by chance, once I'd finished my trial, I was asked by Philip Prince, who's a South African currently living in the United States, to start doing research with him. And he said, what should we do? And so I suggested a research plan, and we worked through it slowly. And over 7 years, we produced some amazing studies. And that then proved to me that you didn't need carbs. And at the
Mm.
same time, I was rewriting my book, Law of Running. And that's forced me, because I was 20 years out of the field. I wasn't doing high quality exercise physiology research for at least 10 years, maybe a few years before that. And so I was out of the field for so long that I then came back. Now I have to revise the book, which is 20 years out of date. And my eyes were open, because now I knew a bit more about human healthy nutrition. And when I looked at what's happened in the last 20 years, I could see that it's leading somewhere. And every day it took me further down to understand what's going on. And ultimately, I realized that the problem is that there are two carbohydrate pools in the body. Everyone assumes that there's one carbohydrate pool, and so you take carbohydrates, it sort of goes into the all over the body, but there's no different differentiation.
Mm.
And I worked out particularly over the last 6 months, that there are two pools, and they're totally differently regulated. And that's where the problem arises. And the one is in the liver and the bloodstream, and that I call the small glucose pool. And that is regulated to keep the blood glucose as flat as possible. That's the most important metabolic response in the body. The whole body focuses on keeping your blood glucose normal. And that's because we evolved to eat high protein diets.
Mm.
And then we suddenly started eating the grains, and now the system is out of whack. And so, but it still remains that the design is to keep your glucose low.
Yeah. And you say 5 grams all the
Yeah,
time.
that's right. And then you go and eat 400 grams a day, which you're trying to stuff into 5 grams. That has to cause problems in the long term. But my moment of greatest insight was I went and looked at a slide I'd shown 1,000 times, maybe not 1,000 times, but 100 times at least in lectures. And it shows what happened when we started measuring muscle glycogen. And they showed this relationship between the more glycogen in the muscles, the more you could exercise, the longer you could maintain exercise performance. And what they missed was what was happening to blood glucose levels. And they completely hid it. Although they published the graph, they didn't discuss it. But up to that point, that was now 1967 when we started measuring muscle glycogen, the whole focus had been on blood glucose as the limiting factor for human performance. And the Scandinavians had shown it. And the next generation of Scandinavians came and said, we could just ignore that finding. We can forget what has been known for 40 years. It's got nothing to do with blood glucose. It's all to do with muscle glycogen. But in the original study, the 1967 study, it's clear. The guys stopped exercising not because they'd run out of muscle glycogen, but because their blood glucose was in their boots. That's why they stopped.
Mm.
So there'd be no change. If those guys had properly interpreted the information, they would have said, well, this exactly supports what the Scandinavians were saying in 1939. But they didn't. And why didn't they do it? Because they were doing muscle biopsies, and we're the experts, and it's not glucose, it's glycogen. And the problem that people haven't recognized is that it was all based on association. It was an association between a low glycogen and fatigue. That wasn't the causal. They hadn't proved causation. But we all were sucked in, and I was amongst the first to suck in. I mean, we were the first to do biopsies in South Africa, and we were the first to do biopsies on ultra marathoners, and we did everything. And the muscle biopsy was the king, and muscle glycogen was the king. And if you weren't doing muscle biopsies, you were nothing. You weren't a good scientist. So we were all flummoxed by it, and it took a long time for me to realize that we were wrong.
I'm very happy to talk to you today in sports nutrition and performance, because I grew up with a dad who in 1985 was running 2 hours 13 minutes in marathon in France.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a family with that narrative of you need carb, like all day. So he was not eating a lot of fat. He was eating a lot of carbs. I later train and compete in triathlon, and I was able to eat 1 kilogram of pasta a day, without any problem. And
Yeah,
I was lean. I was no problem. I thought as long as you exercise, calories in, calories out, everything
yeah,
is fine. But then when you reach later on 35, and I gained like 10 kilos over a year, and I
yeah,
couldn't. I was going to work out every day, 2 hours for 5 months, but nothing changed.
yeah,
So that's why when I did your course on the low carb and sports nutrition in the Nutrition Network online training, you were talking about what you just said, which is the anaplerotic theory versus the
yeah,
central governor model. And I found it very fascinating. Could you develop this motor cortex
yeah.
uh, feedback to the muscle?
So let's begin by saying that the most obvious observation in human physiology is that there's this fall in the amount of exercise you can do with increasing duration, and it follows an equation.
Mhm.
And it doesn't matter who you are, that's the curve that you sit on. The better runners are at the top and the worst at the bottom. But we all show the same curve.
Mhm.
And no one can explain what possible mechanism is for this mathematically function. How can you explain that because your muscles are running out of glycogen? That as someone said, it's like you've got a dimmer switch. So your performance just dims a little bit as you go further. It's not a and stop. But all scientists say, try to explain it by an on-off switch. You've got the switch on and you can go flat out and then it suddenly turns off.
Mhm.
But that's not how the body's clearly working. Now, there's absolutely no way that a metabolic event can give you this mathematical relationship. The only thing it can do is if it's coming from the brain, the pacing strategy is coming in the brain. But that's it takes time to get to that point. But let's look at the on-off switch argument. So the on-off switch is that you run out of glycogen, and then you can't produce any more ATP for the muscles to work. So you're going along and you hit the wall or whatever, and you finished. And that's the on-off switch. And the problem is you don't run out of ATP. If you biopsy athletes during runs, they don't get less and less ATP, and then suddenly there's no more ATP. And ATP is highly regulated as well and stays the same. So the anaplerotic theory doesn't work, and no one worries about that. But also, if you run out of ATP, the muscles go into rigor. They don't relax. That's what happens. It's not
Mhm.
that they can't produce force, they just don't relax. And we never see that. I've never seen that outside of death. So therefore, that's not the mechanism. So the only dimmer switch you can have is if the brain is programmed before you start, this is how you're going to perform. And that's the central governor model. And the reason you've got a set brain is to protect you from damage. And so that's why you never run out of ATP, because the brain is getting information from the muscles. It knows exactly how hard you're exercising. It knows exactly what's safe for you to do, and it allows you to do it. And the best athletes, I think, are just genetically, they have a different pacing strategy. They're able to sustain a higher work rate, particularly after about an hour and a half or 2 hours, than the rest of us. And of course, training makes a huge difference. But if you're sorry, what a point you will have recognized is that the really great athletes, they're already great before they've even started training. They faster, they've got more endurance. And if you want to know who's going to be the future champion, it's always the ones who've done very little training and then they suddenly run a race and my gosh, they come fourth or fifth. And
Mhm.
if you haven't come fourth or fifth after your second or third attempt and you're training hard, you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
You don't have the abilities.
But the brain will shut down the muscle
Yeah,
by because they get the information that the blood glucose is getting low
that's
from
correct.
from the liver glycogen. Is it correct?
That's correct. That's one mechanism.
Okay.
The problem is if you stop that mechanism, as we suggest by taking 10 grams per hour of carbohydrate, you still get tired.
Uh-huh.
And that's where the problem is. Exercise physiology has been so dominated by industry. It's all carbohydrates or fats or whatever. But that explains the first 3 hours. But beyond 3 hours, we don't know, because your glucose can be perfectly normal and you're still tired. So that's when the other forms of fatigue come in. So the metabolic ones, the carbohydrate ones, really only explain short duration fatigue of between, say, 2 and 4 hours. That can definitely be influenced by your blood glucose. But short of that and longer than that, it's many other things. And that's got nothing to do with metabolic fuels.
And that would be genetic?
Yeah, I think that the ability to be exceptional is very strongly genetically determined. But you have to train extremely hard. So you've got to have the two. But if you take the people who haven't got those genes, they can train very hard and not be successful. Not be as successful.
So for someone who would be completely foreign to this concept of low carb, high fat for sports performance, could you explain why fats on these 3 first hours are a much more reliable and healthy source of energy compared to carbs?
Okay, so what happened was that when these original studies were done with muscle glycogen biopsies and so on, they decided without testing. That's the key. The whole basis of science is disproof. It's not proof, it's disproof. So they decided, you see that the reason why glycogen was so important is because when you do exercise at high intensity, you burn glycogen. And that's absolutely true if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet. But the reason you burn it is not to exercise faster. It's to get rid of the glycogen, because your body doesn't want glycogen to be stored in excess. That's clearly the case. So what's happened is we've said, the reason why you're burning glycogen is because it's this jet fuel. So one of the studies we did in the 1990s, we studied people at rest. And we found that a good proportion were burning carbohydrates, the jet fuel, at rest. And no one questioned. No one said, why are they burning glycogen at rest if this is the jet fuel? And then the lady who was doing her PhD in my department, she found that the ones who were burning glycogen were eating the high carbohydrate diets. So now you have a reason. You can see if you eat a high carbohydrate diet, you'll burn muscle glycogen as your preferred fuel. And the ones who were burning fat at rest were eating a low carbohydrate diet and a more high fat diet. So what you burn during exercise is entirely determined by your blood insulin concentration, which is entirely determined not by your fitness, not by your training, by how much glycogen is in the muscles and in the liver. That determines how much the muscle glycogen you'll burn. Now, why would we be created to burn glycogen, and that glycogen is controlling its own use? And glycogen controls its own use by stimulating the insulin. Because if you have a high muscle glycogen, you'll have a high insulin, and the insulin inhibits fat oxidation. So all the research in the last 50 years or 40 odd years has been done on athletes who are in the wrong metabolic state. They start exercise with a high insulin and a high muscle glycogen. And what the body is trying to do is to get rid of all that glycogen, because it knows you're going to have another high carbohydrate meal in 4 or 5 hours. And what it wants to do is get that carbohydrate out of the bloodstream into the muscles. That's what it's got to do to keep your blood glucose normal. And that's why we've got the problem. Now, what the clever scientists did next is they said, oh, we're going to test you. You've got to eat all these carbs because we want you to do maximum exercise. And you've got to eat carbs. So, of course, what they find is that they don't burn any fat. So then they say, well, you see, you can't burn fat doing high intensity exercise.
Okay. Still
So
an association.
Sorry.
It is so still an association.
Yeah, it's still an association. And what you have to do is you have to disprove it. You have to test it. And that's what we did. Initially, we didn't realize what we were doing. We did know we were trying to disprove it. So in our second study, we studied people running a mile on the treadmill when they'd eaten a high carb diet or a high fat diet for 4 to 6 weeks. And there was no difference in performance, absolutely nothing, which I found difficult to believe at the time. But I mean, the results were very clear. And then I'd warned the researchers, I said, what they're going to say to you is that, oh, that's easy because the guys started with lots of glycogen. So even though they were eating a high-fat diet, they had lots of glycogen in their muscles. So you're just not actually proving your point. So I said, what we have to do is we have to do 800-meter repetitions because we know after 4 or 5 800-meter repetitions, you'll have burned up all your glycogen. So we said, let's do 6. So we do 6 of these. And then by chance, we were measuring their metabolism at the same time, which I hadn't suggested, but the researchers anyway did it. And we found the high. So then they were exercising at 86% VO2 max. Now, why is that important? Because the textbook, and you can go and look at the slides in your textbook, says that 85% VO2 max, your amount of fat you're burning is 0 grams per minute, 0. That's what the textbook says. I'm sorry I don't have a textbook to show you the figure, but it's a classic. As you get to 85%, you burn nothing. We found the highest rates of fat oxidation in history at 86% VO2 max. So that completely throws out this idea that you can't burn fat during high intensity exercise. And that changes everything because it turns out if you want to run a sub 2-hour marathon, you can do it by burning fat almost exclusively by those numbers. So that really destroys it. So that's where we are today. Fat, you can burn fat at a high rate, and it's only we didn't realize it because we were studying people who were carbohydrate adapted, and they had high insulins, and the insulin is the key. Insulin drives your metabolism during exercise, and if it's elevated, you're not going to burn fat, you're going to burn carbs. So the whole textbook of exercise physiology is written on athletes who are exercising with high insulin and low free fatty acids and low fat oxidation. And as soon as you get the insulins down by putting people on a low carb diet, they start burning fat at rates you've never seen before. And my good friend Louise Burke, who we have great arguments with, she did a lovely study, took some really world-class athletes, put them on a high-fat diet for 5 days, and in 5 days they were burning fat as high as we had measured at 1.5 grams per minute. Enormous. You can do anything on 1.5 grams per minute of fat oxidation.
So only 5 days of adaptation?
5 days. And so what does that tell me? That tells me that, of course, these athletes are trained, but they're never burning that amount of fat in their training because they're eating high carb diets. The only exception, I think, would be like if you look at the Tour de France cyclists, I suspect they often train in a low carb diet, and then they would be burning high rates of fat at high rates. So they do stimulate those pathways, but I don't even think you have to do it. My view is that the human body is designed for burning fat. It's always there, but your diet decides whether you're going to show it or not. And if you're eating a high carb diet, you're never going to show high rates of fat oxidation.
But how?
So,
sorry, go ahead.
The idea that you have to go and train to burn fat is not true. It's got to train yourself not to eat carbs, and then you burn lots of fat.
Yes. So from your own practice and research studies, what is in general the time of adaptation for an athlete to go from a high carb, low fat diet into a high fat, low carb diet? So you just answered. You said
Yeah.
there's.
Metabolically, the metabolic shift occurs in 5 days, but it's not the total answer, because we've shown that it takes about 4 weeks for your glucose metabolism to normalize, and performance can take much longer. I think that elite athletes take longer because they have to learn to train on a low carb diet. They have to adapt their approach. Their pacing strategies might change, and many of them tell me it takes more than 6 weeks. It takes a bit longer than that for them to get optimum performance. Because, I mean, you have to get the belief system going as well.
Yeah.
You have to believe it's going to work, and you're getting told all the time that it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing you have to work on.
So one day you're switching to this high-fat, low-carb nutrition. What are usually their feedbacks? Meaning, do they feel subjective or objective improvements in terms of mental fatigue, recovery, energy levels?
I think it depends how insulin resistant you are and how pre-diabetic you are. So I was frankly diabetic, and I felt within 24 hours, I felt like a new person.
So what you're saying is like, further you are into a disease process,
yeah,
and quicker you feel better.
yeah, exactly. And you notice it absolutely immediately. And in my case, I'm sure my glucose was bouncing up because I was eating these high carbs. And then as soon as I stopped eating that, my glucose still wasn't normal, but it wasn't going to the extremes that it had on the high carb diet.
Mm-hmm. So someone might be skeptical about this whole idea and say, well, that sounds great, but I never heard about any high-level athletes cutting carbs on training. What about you, Prof. Noakes? Do you know any leading athletes who adopted this low-carb, high-fat nutrition?
Yeah, so I'll tell you one or two little stories. The first one is the greatest triathlete of all time. The triathlete of the millennium is a young lady who's not young anymore, Paula Fraser, who is a South African Zimbabwean. And she was just getting good in the triathlon when I was getting more involved with the athletes. And she won a race in South Africa and then went to do the Ironman. And in her first event, I think she came third, and she'd hardly done any training. And that's my story. You know, the really great athletes, they do it without the training. So she goes to America and lives in San Diego and starts training. Then she phones me one day and she says, Prof, I can't get out of bed in the morning. I said, what's the problem? She said, these people are driving me. They're training me so hard. I'm exhausted. So I said to her, well, okay, I think maybe what you should do is do what you've always done, but just increase maybe a bit of the intensity of some of your workouts. So that was the first advice I gave her. Then a few months later, 1984, she phones me and she says, do you know this guy called Steve Phinney? So Steve Phinney was the guy who eventually would write the book that saved my life. And I said, yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. He's just done a study of people adapting to a high-fat diet, and their performance wasn't impaired. It wasn't improved, but it wasn't impaired. And I said, that makes sense to me. You're going to burn lots of fat during prolonged exercise. Maybe just eat a bit more fat. So she said, do you think I should eat more fat? I said, yes, you should, Paula. So anyway, she goes away and she wins the Kona Ironman 8 times. And she wins 26 Ironman triathlons. And she becomes the triathlete of the millennium. And when she came to speak to me in Cape Town, she came visiting, she said, Tim, the advice you gave me was the most important piece of advice I had in my whole career. So I said, what was that? What advice did I give you? She said, you told me I must restrict my carbs. I said, I never told you that. I said, you must eat more fat. so she was the first lady who started restricting carbs and eating a high-fat diet. And she came and competed in Cape Town in the R triathlon. And I remember she had a big bowl of ice cream the night before. Maybe there was a bit of sugar in it, but she was continued to eat fat. And she said it was easy for her because she came from Africa. And in Africa, we eat a lot of processed meat called biltong or jerky. We grazed on it. Yes. And she said it was easy. I mean, she'd always eaten that. Anyway, so that was the first one. So then there's Dave Scott. Now, Dave Scott has also won 6 Ironman triathlons. And he wrote to me a few years ago after he'd read one of my books called The Real Meal Revolution. And he said, Prof, I trained on a vegan diet. I won those 6 Ironmans on a vegan diet, vegan vegetarian diet.
Okay.
And he said it was a disaster, a total disaster. He said, yes, I won the races, but my mental state was a disaster. And that was what he admitted to me. He said, I discovered your diet. So then I should change that, because then he did go back after he'd won his 6. He went back when he said, I was starting to eat fish. I was eating salmon. And at the age of 40, he had a really good Ironman. He came second, I think. And he said, that was the first time I started eating more fish and meat. Anyway, he said to me, I wish I'd followed your diet in the 1970s. I would have run an hour. I would have done the Ironman an hour faster.
He must have been very, very talented.
Yeah. No, he was, to overcome it. And he said, now this is not Tim Noakes, who knows nothing about triathlons, who knows nothing about elite athletes. This is Dave Scott, who was one of the first. He said, I would never, ever advise a heavily trained athlete to eat a high carbohydrate diet. He says you just burn out. After 5 or 6 years, you're finished. So that's... Now, so then you ask, so why aren't the athletes in the Tour de France eating high-fat diets? And I tell you, you just got to follow the money. There's involvement of the industry somewhere that's preventing the athletes from trying it. I was working with a South African professional cyclist, and he got a contract to compete in Europe. I'm not sure if he ever made the Tour de France, but he was on a professional team. And he was doing very well on a high-fat diet. And he said, as soon as I got on the team, they said, you will drop that diet if you want to be on our team. You will eat carbohydrates. So it's a complete cult, and you're not allowed to do different. Sorry, there's another South African story to it all. Now, sometimes my brain isn't quite there, but the guy who wins, Chris Froome. Chris Froome trains in South Africa. He trains in Johannesburg on a high-carb diet, and he's 7 kilos. He looks gross. I mean, for a world-class cyclist, he was overweight. He goes to Spain, and he does the Spanish race, and he comes second. So from nowhere, being very ordinary, he comes second. And he comes to Cape Town to see his girlfriend, and he's looking starved. And she says, "What are you doing?" She says, "No, I'm eating a high-protein diet. I learned to, and I lost my weight. I lost my hunger." And he lost 6 kilos, and he came second. So she said, "No, I don't think that's such a good idea. Maybe we should put you on a slightly more balanced diet." And so he then continues at that weight, and he wins 4 Tour de France's. He could not win the Tour de France eating a high carbohydrate diet. He personally couldn't do it because he was overweight, because he was always hungry. And that's, so there you go.
Did he manage to impose that diet in his team?
No, I don't think so. I saw him, there was one picture on the breakfast day of the day they weren't racing, and there was eating eggs and bacon and something. And he says, this is a winner's diet or something. Everyone got so angry with him. And there's another story. The top ultra marathon trainer in South Africa is a guy called Nick Bester. Amazing, amazing coach. I mean, if you follow the Comrades Marathon, his athletes win every race in the last 10 years. He's just astonishing. So his latest champion, he shows a picture of him the night before the race. The next day, he went out and beat the record, and he beat everyone by minutes. And he set the record. And he was eating a massive steak. It wasn't just one steak. There was steak, and there was something else as well on this time. And I challenged him. He said, "Tim, I was a carnivore before you were born," which is not true because I'm older than him. But he's an Afrikaner in South Africa, and that's how he would have been raised. He would have been raised on a meat-based diet. And so those guys winning the Comrades, you don't see them slurping back the carbs during the race. They don't need to. I watched very carefully this year, and the lady who won the race, who's an astonishing runner, she was not taking carbs every 10 minutes or 5 minutes, and the same with the male runners. So
Do you
how they run world records at 80 kilometers, or sorry, it's 90 kilometers, how are they setting world records at 90 kilometers without taking in 120 grams of carbs per hour? Because you don't need it.
But do you think this will become a growing trend in the
Yeah,
future in
yes.
athletes?
Because eventually the athletes are going to get diabetes and they're going to realize. There's a guy called Saunders, I think his name's Leon Saunders, who was a very good triathlete and competitive in the Ironman. He's declared that he has type 2 diabetes. He has pre-diabetes and a sugar addiction. Because that's part of the problem, is the sugar addiction.
Yeah.
And these guys are, it's very difficult if you have a sugar addiction to avoid sugar. It's going to impact you on your performance, no question. So I'm beginning to wonder, to what extent is the performance effects because you're actually controlling your sugar addiction? Yeah.
Would you say that there is an inverse relationship in duration between the level of carbs intake or carb addiction and the length of your career? Like you said, that Dave Scott said that you would not advise it because then they would be burned after 5 or 6 years. Do you think that eating a high fat, low carb would prolong the career of an athlete?
I have no doubt about it. And, I'm working with some other teams, and they've noticed in contact sports, and they've noticed dramatic effects going from a completely carb diet to a completely carnivore, almost 100% carnivore diet. And the benefits are huge, and they're things that we would never, ever have thought. Yeah. So it's only a matter of time. And these are big athletes involved in contact sports, which are highly explosive contact sports. And they get these benefits. The benefits are so great, I don't want to advertise them because those athletes are getting a benefit. And I don't want the whole world to know about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, okay, you've done your 6 times 800 meter study with disprove the whole muscle glycogen theory. You have so many professional athletes performing without any sugar. But I feel, or maybe I'm wrong, but do you feel that in the academia, in the research, it seems that it's still the carbo-loading that is promoted?
Oh, absolutely.
Why
I
is
mean,
that?
let's remember, I got thrown out of my profession and charged with misinformation for promoting a real food diet. And the FDA, the Federal Drug Agency, yesterday declared that there are no longer any links, no limitation on saturated fat intake. Now, I went to court and was charged and had to spend enormous time and effort and money to clear my name for saying exactly that. Exactly that. That you should be eating saturated fat if you want to not have heart disease. Now it's accepted. Now that's now 11 years later. 2014, I was saying it. Now it's 2025. The FDA declares it, that we were correct. So, and the whole thing about eating carbs is because you mustn't eat saturated fat. So that's fallen by the wayside for long-term health. This is going to fall. The carbohydrate story will fall in time. But it's going to take a lot of time. I mean, on Twitter, when I start talking about this, there's the negative comments are huge. But there's, and the typical one is, tell me which winner of the Tour de France ever took a high fat diet. Why aren't any of these athletes on high fat diets? And the answer is because they're a cult and they're following the cult. They're not going to challenge it because they risk their careers to challenge it.
Yeah. And I'm not accusing anyone, of course, but you hear the case every year and every year and every year. So, but obviously the diet, because I had an argument once with another trainer and he said, yeah, I was in the US and I don't think diet, like I met people in the American football
Yeah.
team, and some were eating more meat, some were vegan and stuff. I said, but at that level, that type of sport, I don't think nutrition is the only factor to be followed. Just to say it this way, just, and you see in the Tour de France, I mean, cycling is, of course, the first guy, the first two, three guys on the podium, they always come up with cases. So I can only imagine the one behind.
Yeah. Yeah.
You see, so of course, maybe it's just supposition, but this supposition become reality year after year. So I think there is a misconception for a lot of people between the nutrition when if you study nutrition like you in a very scientific way, okay, then we can talk like today, like the central governor model and everything. But the reality of professional sport is also different.
Absolutely. I mean, let's go back to American football. I mean, they're some of the most obese athletes you'll see, the defensive linemen. And there's no way they wouldn't do better getting rid of all that fat because they become more mobile. I understand it's because you just got to be immobile,
Mm.
but that's not healthy what they're eating.
What would be
So
the sorry.
no, carry on.
No, I was wondering what would be the percentage, in your opinion, of maybe you have an idea, but of endurance athletes who become metabolically ill after once they finish their career, when they reach 40, 45?
Yeah, that's a great question because remember, you're dealing with a highly selected population.
Mhm.
There are millions of cyclists at the bottom or athletes at the bottom. And the group that get to the top, in my view, may get there because they're so insulin sensitive they can eat this rubbish diet without killing them. Because you mentioned, what about the second guy? We always speak about Kipchoge and all these great runners, but we don't talk about the guy who's coming fourth or fifth, who's eating the same diet.
Mm.
And we don't think that maybe he's half a kilogram heavier because he's got visceral obesity, which is the exact cause. The high carbohydrate diet causes visceral obesity. You don't see it. I mean, because the Kenyans all look incredibly lean. But if you took and measured their livers and see how much fat is in the liver and the gut, that extra kilogram is going to kill you. That's enough to destroy you. And the same in the Tour de France. So my argument would be that to be the top in the Tour de France or in a Kenyan running, eating a high carb diet, you have to be exquisitely insulin sensitive because otherwise you'd be obese. But you'd be obese by 1 kilo or 2 kilos, and that's it. That's enough to kill. Yeah. And that's take Chris Froome. Chris Froome's a classic example. He was carrying 6 kilos, of which 2 would have been hidden in his gut at least. 2 or 3 would have been in his gut and would not have been detected unless someone looked at it. So that's my argument. Looking at the top few, Pogacar and they are probably so insulin sensitive they can eat what they like all their lives. I'm not saying they can, but they probably can, but could. But we forget the ones who aren't quite as good. So we see the Tour de France, we see the top 200 cyclists in the world. But what about the next 200? How insulin sensitive are they, and how much visceral obesity is present there? And that extra 1 kilo is enough to slow them down on the hills, and they're not competitive.
Yeah. So are you doing any research on that? Because I never heard that, but I think this is absolutely great.
Yeah. Because I'm retired, I've been retired now for 12 years. I don't have access to that much research. But I mean, that's a question but you wouldn't be allowed to study it because I know what's happening. There's a local doctor. In fact, there are 2 local doctors who are doctors on the Tour de France. And the one of them said to me last year, he said, you should see the diet of the guys on the Tour de France. And this guy doesn't believe in what I believe in, what a good diet is. He's way over the carb side. And he said the diets are disgusting of these athletes. It's absolutely appalling. They just eat whatever. Well, I'm not suggesting they don't have good chefs and so on, but the extra stuff that they're eating and all the Coca-Colas and that stuff. I mean, it's amazing that such high quality athletes can put such rubbish into their mouths.
I'm always amazed to see the sponsors for big competition like Olympic Games and
Yeah.
World Championships and everything that are McDonald's and Coca-Cola, Pepsi.
That's
I'm like,
right.
there's something wrong there.
Yeah, exactly right.
So now we talk on let's say that same skeptical person that we spoke about before might eventually be convinced about the athletic perspective if they start to study it and the one that you're offering. But he or she might still think that eating a high-fat diet would be dangerous as it would increase the total cholesterol and the LDL and thus increase the risk of heart disease, to which Prof. Tim Noakes answers.
The answer is the only relationship between cholesterol and heart disease is associational. There's no direct evidence that cholesterol's got anything to do with arterial disease. That's it. There's zero evidence. And again, it's all industry. And what happened with industry was Ansel Keys came along in the 1950s and said that saturated fat's causing your cholesterol to rise and then you're getting heart disease. He would base it all on associational studies. When he did clinical trials, he did 2 clinical trials, both of which disproved his hypothesis. He hid the data. And the data were only published later. And that's the same with all the studies in which they've tried to manipulate cholesterol and see the outcomes. They never found any benefit. Atherosclerosis is caused by there are a couple of diseases, but diabetes is the most prevalent. The other one is, and I'm just think of the name, it's a disease in Africa where the blood vessels become very rigid and they scrape the arteries. And they have the most severe arterial disease, got nothing to do with cholesterol, but it's a damage to the arterial lining.
Yeah.
And
which is usually, from what I saw, also related to high blood glucose or too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Do you know, it's really interesting because one of the people who taught me, his son is on our low carb story. He's one of our lecturers, and his son's a very, very clever man, like his father was. And he trained at Critical Care Hospital, this hospital I trained, and for what he was studying was infusing glucose into the liver cells. And he said, we just destroyed the veins and the arteries. We just destroyed them with glucose. And when we did experiments, which were so critical to my understanding, where we infused glucose into the veins of athletes for, let's say, 2 hours, they come back the next day and the whole vein would be inflamed. And we'd say, yeah, well, you see, it must have been a parasite or a bacteria. It wasn't. It was the glucose damaging the lining of the vein. And that glucose is highly toxic for the linings of arteries and veins, and it's forgotten. Yeah. But in all the studies, it's diabetes is the number one cause. It's not the most only cause, and it's not the most dangerous cause. As I've said, if your blood vessels are rigid and they don't bend, that causes severe arterial disease.
But when you say diabetes, we also understand elevated blood glucose, but do you also imply high insulin?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the good question is whether it's the glucose or the insulin. And it doesn't matter because they're both acting at the same time.
But because you mentioned in one of your class and also what you shared about your own experience was that for a long time your blood glucose remained stable and you were safe. And most people, I think, now are in the same case. They go to the doctor, they see, okay, that's fine, the HbA1c is fine, it's a little bit elevated, but the reality is that the fasting insulin is not all the time checked.
Yeah, that's right. It's never checked. And that's the irony. Endocrinologists, which are experts on the endocrine system, they never bother to measure the major hormone, the most important hormone, insulin. They never mention it. Never
Mm.
measure it. I was going to say this, what happened with Ansel Keys, he said it's all saturated fat. And then they found this drug that can lower it, and then they developed the statins. And that terminated all research onto what's causing arterial disease. Because we know, we know it's because of the high cholesterol. And we've got the treatment, that's a statin, and that's going to prevent arterial disease in the future. Now, the point of that statement is that if you found the cause and you remove the cause, you cure the condition. We have spent so much money lowering cholesterol that the heart disease should have disappeared. It hasn't, it's just got worse. It's got worse because of the diabetes. Now, no one will tell you that. If you know the cause and you remove the cause, the disease disappears. So therefore, if you know the cause is cholesterol and you remove it by treating with statins, the disease disappears. It hasn't disappeared. That
Mm.
proves the hypothesis is totally wrong.
Yeah.
And then we mentioned the FDA have said saturated fat is fine. So they've agreed that the cholesterol story is just bunk. It's just rubbish.
And I think also to disprove, there's a very simple and logic way of seeing it. I saw it with my grandmother. She's 90 now, but many people are in her case. They've been avoiding saturated fat or cholesterol. They've been using margarine, seed oils, and everything all their lives. They avoided fats, but then she got the arteries
Yeah.
completely blocked with cholesterol. So how come you can avoid these fats all your
Yeah.
life? Be careful about this, and then end up with the very specific disease that you're avoiding.
Exactly.
Doesn't make sense.
Exactly right. It doesn't make sense. And it just takes one case to disprove it. One of my great friends was a coach, physical coach, trainer coach of the Springbok rugby team in the 1990s. And he just emailed me the other day. He said his cholesterol is 9, which is it's almost twice normal. And he said his arteries at the age of 70 are pristine. They are absolutely pristine. Now, he comes from an area of South Africa where they have all the centenarians. There's a small village which he comes from, but why was that? Because there was no pesticides, there was no spraying, and they ate real food, came directly from the farm without any processing, and that's why everyone's so healthy there, because they eat so well.
Mm.
And he's eaten so well for 70 years, and despite his high cholesterol. So I thought that was lovely.
But just to share a personal, when I started this low carb, I first had the first month and a half, I lost 4 kilos, and then the next month another 4, and that was at the time I was going to Thailand, and for a month, and then I said, okay, I'm going to sign up into this Thai boxing camp, and I'm going to go every day. But I went from a 25 years experience of fooling myself with carbs, packing the carbs before going to the training. I would not even go to the training if I didn't eat pasta 3 or 4 hours before. Psychologically, I would be afraid to not be performing enough. So now I'm going into a training with just nothing, like fasted state. And it was the first time I was like, let's see how this whole low carb will work. And the training was supposed to last 1 hour and a half. So the trainer, after 1 hour 50, he was like, okay, now it's finished. And I said, no, I want to continue, because I was not looking at the clock. And then he
Yeah.
showed me the clock and he said, look, it's 20 minutes more.
Yeah.
And I was not even tired. Of course, you're tired when you do the exercise, but energetically, I could continue for another hour or two.
Yeah.
And same when I do wrestling, which is very intense.
It's
All the
absolutely.
young people, I'm 39, I'm one of the oldest. After an hour and a half, I'm still up. I breathe normally. I have no problem. And all the youngs, they're on their back. on the ground looking the ceilings, and they're dead after 1 hour.
That's right.
So I can share my own experience about this high fat, low carb for sports. No.
So I mentioned the name of my friend Louise Burke, who we haven't always been so friendly, but the American College of Sports Medicine asked us to debate the high carb, high fat diets. So we had a debate, and it's published in the Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise, and anyone can read it. But the interesting thing was that we first made our arguments, and then we had to rebut the other person's arguments. What was really interesting was my rebuttal of Louise's work. You couldn't trace it on the internet. I thought, now, how come? So whenever you typed in the debate, you got her 2 articles and you got my original article. But my other article, which rebutted what she said, it literally disappeared off the internet. And I couldn't understand why that happened. Anyway, we're having another debate now for the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And I've submitted mine. She's submitted hers, and I haven't actually read it yet, so I don't know what her arguments are. But I conclude that nutrition has got nothing to do with exercise performance. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. That's what the evidence shows. Whether you're eating high fat or high carbohydrate, the performance is identical. And the only distinction is if you're going to go for more than 2 or 3 hours, you do need a little bit of extra carbs to prevent hypoglycemia. And that's what I claim the evidence shows. I'm going to be very interested to see how she defends the argument and says carbs are essential. Because I promise you, I know how to read the literature, and I read everything, and there's absolutely no evidence. Including there was one study from New Zealand where the guys that got people to run for 50 kilometers on a treadmill. 50 kilometers. Now, I know how difficult it is to run on a treadmill.
Yes.
And that was their test. That was their performance test. 50 kilometers after either a high carb diet or a high fat diet. Performance was identical. Absolutely no difference. So where's the evidence that you need carbs to run 50 kilometers?
Yeah.
But it's not the only study. We've got all our studies showing exactly the same.
So these studies, and I want to show that book because I will tell you why after. This is the book that the Nutrition Network and the Noakes Foundation has produced. And the amount of scientific references is huge.
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult to debate this book.
Exactly right.
And the subtitle is The Science of Therapeutic Carbohydrate Restriction in Human Health. And it's funny because I first did this channel to bring an awareness into the French-speaking community.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find any doctors except one whose name is Professor Delorgeril. And he fought the cholesterol hypothesis a lot. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then before we do the interview, he asked me to read his book. So, of course, on the cholesterol, he agrees with you and everything, but he has promoted the Mediterranean diet for so long. And when we did the interview, I did not publish it. I will tell you why, because he was so sure of himself. And he said, oh, I'm a cardiologist.
Yeah.
I said, okay. And I've been doing this for since 1960, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay. And then he said to me, there's no science about what you call ketogenic.
Yeah.
I didn't reply. I didn't show that to him because if a man like that who was able to apply a certain discipline, scientific discipline and rigor to challenge the cholesterol hypothesis, the lipid heart hypothesis, doesn't want to, on the other hand, open his mind to look if there's a science to what we call ketogenic, what's the point of arguing?
Yeah.
But I was so surprised. He said there's no science. And then you see this book.
Yeah.
There's like sometimes more page of references than the page of the actual.
No, I mean, I think, that's one of our major achievements of the Nutrition Network and our foundation was getting that book published because we're not a medical school,
Hmm.
and we convinced 60 odd people to contribute for nothing to write the book. That shows the commitment.
Yeah.
But every single one of those 60 people had a dietary problem, all of them. And they
Uh,
cured it with the diet. They cured it with the diet. And that's the difference. Yeah. So we were
so
all insulin resistant, and we discovered the one diet that works. And then that's why we tried to share it with everyone.
I have two more questions, if you allow me.
Sure, of course.
Um, okay, we say ketogenic, which is a physiological state, and but we call it, as the name is also used to describe nutrition.
Mm,
But I feel that ketogenic, to me, it's always difficult for me to define when someone say, what is it? Because you could be fasting for 3 days and be in a ketogenic state.
mm.
You could maybe be vegan and be in a ketogenic state. So how would you define ketogenic versus, for example, animal-based or carnivore diet? Is that the same
Yeah.
continuum?
Yeah,
Is it?
I don't kind of get too involved in those debates. I think the key is to reduce the carbohydrates
Yeah.
and to get your insulin down, and that then turns off carbohydrate metabolism, and it can turns you onto a fat metabolism, of which one of the consequences ketosis.
Mhm.
But the ketosis is different, very different. And once you go into ketotic state, actually after about 3 weeks or 4 weeks, your blood ketone levels drop and drop quite dramatically because you start using the ketones. And so you can't say, well, it's a ketone level, blood level of such and such, because that works initially, but doesn't work subsequently.
Mm.
I think that it's trying to make the statement that carbohydrate restriction produces a different metabolic state. And that metabolic state is the feature is ketosis, lipolysis, breakdown of lipids, and storage of carbohydrate, not use of carbohydrate. That's the kind of the total state.
So you would use low carb as a more
Yeah. And
definition.
I think we use it because low carbs is not acceptable. It's not a term that's acceptable in the medical profession.
Okay.
We've spoken about Jeff Volek, who
Mhm.
wrote one of the books, and he said he applied for 20 years to the National Institute of Health for funding to do low carb studies. And he said as soon as they see low carb, they just tossed it in the waste paper basket. It's a swear word, so you can't use that.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
so
Crazy.
ketogenic is a slightly safer word. But I must tell you that in my trial, they asked the experts, and they had not the first idea what ketosis was, not the first idea.
So who were the expert?
The experts were two professors of nutrition from a university further north,
Mhm.
the vice president of the Medical Research Council. So that's the Medical Research Council is the council that decides where they're going to spend their money in South Africa. And he was the vice president. He had this much knowledge of ketosis. It was embarrassing.
Okay.
And then they brought in a psychiatrist who said, Noakes has killed millions of babies. I mean, and this is, he's trying to be a serious professor. That I think they had one or two others, but that they really didn't. There was no one of any consequence.
Because I
So
checked the baby formula the other day on the grocery store
yeah,
ingredient,
yeah,
and I was seeing all these things, and I was imagining, is this present in the mom's milk?
yeah.
Of course not.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah, yeah.
So, at the moment, Prof. Noakes, what are the activities in the field of health and nutrition that you are involved in?
So I'm obviously retired,
Uh-huh.
and so I'm not running a unit as I did for 30 or 40 years. But I am working with Philip Prince from from Pennsylvania. And we have studies ongoing, and it started 7 years ago, and we've done some magnificent studies, all trying to disprove our theories. And all they do is they show that we were correct all along.
Mm.
So we published a really important paper earlier this year in which we proved conclusively, definitively. It took us 7 years to get the ingredients for the trial. Because, that's when you do research, you start from a small base and you can only do this. And then as you get a bit more money and a bit more expertise, you can do a bit more. And it took us 7 years to get to the point where we could do the definitive study, comparing the benefit or the effects of the small glucose pool versus the large glucose pool. No one had ever tested it because they didn't understand the difference. And the key was we had people exercise for a long time, as long as they could, when we give them a tiny amount of glucose to fix up the small glucose space. And then at the same time, they either had eaten lots of carbs before or little carbs. So they started exercise with muscle glycogen with either full or partially empty. And then we gave them either a little bit of glucose during exercise or a placebo. And we showed the only thing that made a difference was taking glucose during exercise. That is a definitive trial. Because we understood what we were trying to do. It was definitive because we only gave a little bit of glucose because we understood the small glucose pool doesn't need much glucose to keep it full. And so that was the definitive study. And then I worked out that there were two different pools regulated separately because of work we did in 1994.
Okay.
Do you think in 1994 we understood what we were seeing? No, we hadn't a clue because it was only carbs. Well, we were just trying to prove carbs work, you see. So as long as they work, that's fine. How they work, that's not material. And so when I went back at that work, it was absolutely brilliant. We had some fantastic work, and that showed that the two pools. But again, we didn't understand it at the time. So that's what we've shown. And then while we were doing this research for the last 4 years, I was working on a major paper. I went and read every single paper where people ingested carbohydrate during exercise and see what happened to their performance. And I asked one question, which no one had ever asked. I said, what happened to the blood glucose concentrations in the control group? So when they do these experiments, you have an experimental group and you have a control group, and the control group gets water or placebo during the experiment, and the other group gets carbohydrates plus whatever else they did. They ingest carbohydrates. And we showed that 88% of the trials, if they showed a positive effect for carbohydrate, now it didn't matter whether you took it before or during the event, that glucose levels fell in the control group. And no one had seen that. So the reason why the carbohydrate intervention worked was because it was preventing hypoglycemia. And that paper is absolutely revolutionary. And it's been accepted essentially almost now. It's within this much of being accepted by a leading journal. And the editors were they could not have been more enthusiastic about the paper. They said, this is revolutionary. It's a paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift is you got to eat lots of carbs before exercise to improve performance. What you eat before makes no difference whatsoever. You can eat high fat, high carbs, but during exercise, you do need a little bit of carbs because that's when the carbohydrate becomes obligatory.
So someone who would have a impaired metabolism because of this massive high carbs intake within their career, would that affect that hypoglycemia state that you just talked about, like within the exercise itself?
So I'm revising Law of Running, and this is now, for 20 years, I hadn't done anything about it. And now I've really committed and with my new insights. And so I've completely rewritten the metabolic chapters to include these stories. And what's been really exciting is to be able to say the following. I'm not telling you what you need to do to eat before exercise. All I'm telling you is that if you fast, this is what happens. If you eat carbs, this is what happens. If you eat fat, this is what happens. And you choose. But the one telling point is what happens after 4 hours, because no one studies it. The very few studies of people eating high carb diets after 4 hours. Because it's really interesting. It's difficult to understand where they get their fuel from after 4 hours when they run out of glycogen. You cannot take in carbohydrate quick enough to replace what you've lost. And if you're not fat adapted and your insulin is high, what are you going to burn? I don't know. And that, if you ask me what was the study I would really like to do, it would be to take your average athlete and have them do 4 hours of exercise and see how their metabolism copes. And all I can see is they're going to have to slow down. They're going to have to slow down because they can't generate enough fuel from fats. Whereas if you're fat adapted, you're fine. You can carry on just doing what you always were doing because there's so much energy from fat. You don't need all the carbs. And the problem is the marathons, most people at 4 hours, they start walking anyway. So that's what I find really interesting. Why are they walking?
Yes.
Is it purely because they're tired, or is it their metabolism is messed up?
But between two athletes, one is highly insulin sensitive, and the other one is more or less insulin average resistance, let's say. So if I understand what you said before, is that hypoglycemia that is induced will be more prevalent into someone with insulin resistant state compared to an insulin sensitive or not?
Yeah, I can't predict because it depends. If you take carbs during exercise, you obliterate that. Hypoglycemia is no longer an issue. But if you don't take carbs, unquestionably the fat adapted athlete's going to go better because they're going to burn fat and spare glycogen, particularly in the liver as well. So they will be fine. And they can become, because they've got ketone bodies, they can burn ketones instead of glucose. And we did a lot of studies on the high-fat diet in the 1990s, end of 90s. And the first one we did, we had a huge effect of the high-fat diet improved performance. And so we thought, well, here's the answer. And the answer was we had these guys go for about 2 hours to deplete everything. And then we had them do a time trial. And in the time trial, the fat-adapted athletes went better because they could go to a lower blood glucose level. They continued to push out the power, even though their glucose had dropped, whereas the other guys stopped when they hadn't taken the high-fat diet. They stopped when their glucose started to drop a bit. But once they were fat-adapted, they went to a much lower blood glucose level. And that's been shown years ago that if you're fat-adapted, you can exercise to you can remain conscious to a much lower level of blood glucose. So they infused insulin into people who were fasted for months. And they took the blood glucose to almost levels that we would think absolutely would cause brain damage. And these people didn't even notice it. Yeah.
So very, very interesting. And for our listeners who would be interested to know more about the Noakes Foundation and the Nutrition Network, and also the Eat Better Africa, is that correct?
South Africa, that's right.
South Africa. Can you tell them what these institutions are doing and how?
Sure. So I've always the books that I write, I've always invested the money in a trust for funding other things. So I fund a couple of researchers and so on. And when we made quite a lot of money on the Real Meal Revolution, which became the best-selling book on new cookbook that had ever been in South Africa, or up to that time, we got quite a lot of money. So I said, well, I'm going to invest this. And then someone said, well, why don't you start a foundation recognizing your father? So the name for the Noakes Foundation is not me, it's my father, because he died of type 2 diabetes and I watched him die and couldn't help him because I didn't understand what the problem was. And then I myself developed type 2 diabetes. So I realized, the genetics are very important. and I should try to do something to help people. So we formed the Noakes Foundation, and so our goal is to promote education in nutrition, healthy nutrition, with a focus on low carb diet and the prevention of type 2 diabetes. Because people, they get so excited about vaccines and viruses. And as soon as someone dies of measles, then, the whole world must be vaccinated against measles. But there were 4 measles deaths in America last year. There are 10,000 new diagnoses of diabetes in my country every month. 10,000. No one, the profession doesn't mention a word. So our goal is to promote that story. And it's really exciting now that the FDA has declared that we were right. The advice we were giving for the
And
last 10
these are diagnosed, meaning that they're the
Yeah,
one which are not diagnosed
yeah,
officially.
exactly. No, that's 10,000 with a new diagnosis based on blood glucose or urinary glucose measures. So that's the scale of the problem is enormous, because South Africans, 40% of the calories eaten in South Africa come from maize. And there's the problem right there.
Mm.
So anyway, then an offshoot was the Nutrition Network, which we realized that we had to train doctors and nutritionists and people like yourself, because you see so many people and you can change so many lives. And so we started teaching that course. And then the other is the Eat Better South Africa campaign, because it turns out that Black South Africans respond incredibly well to a low carb diet. Their diabetes disappears much quicker than Europeans for whatever reason. And so we've gone to the poorest people in South Africa and found the people with diabetes and putting them on these diets, and shown that it is possible. The diet is not that expensive, and that we're getting incredible results from that. So that's the goal of the Eat Better South Africa campaign, is to reverse type 2 diabetes in the poorest populations. So to follow us, it probably start with the Noakes Foundation. Just go to the Noakes Foundation on our website, and that'll give you an idea of what we do.
Yeah, I'll put everything on the show notes, but I want to encourage anyone who's in the field of health or coaching, training, nutrition to go on the Nutrition Network, where you have a very extensive number of courses, which are very well made and detailed. And I'm very happy I've done a lot of them. And I also lost a big contract because of what I learned with you. Because I was working with a big company. I was a contractor. I was hired to do training and massage therapy. And once I got certified with the Nutrition Network, I started to speak about the low carb, high fat diet to the employees. And the woman who was in charge of the well-being department, she asked me that I should not talk about this.
Yeah.
And I asked why, and she said, because you're not a nutritionist. And I said, no, I will not be a nutritionist here, because I don't want to learn that 60% of your food should come from carbs. But I have certification. And she said, well, it's online, it doesn't count. I said, well, you should see like who wrote this book. But anyway, I said, okay. And she basically asked me to not speak about it. And I was facing an ethical dilemma, because people were coming, they were asking me, I do this, I go to the gym, I reduce my eating, but I still have this problem. And I said, well, maybe you should. So should I shut up for a contract, or should I say the truth? And eventually, 6 months later, I lost the contract, and it was a lot of money. But I'm very happy, because as I say in the beginning, looking at you, Dr. Fetke as well, and others, and what you've been through, my case was not too bad, And but yeah, I think we need more people to understand that this is also a very difficult topic to engage in the public sphere.
Absolutely.
especially when you work in this field.
Yeah.
And if you're equipped with the right education, and this is what the Nutrition Network provides, I think you can feel more confident to promote that lifestyle. Yeah.
It's really frustrating to hear that in France that you had that problem because
I'm in Switzerland. But
oh
I'm
sorry
French.
and yeah, because in France the diet's meant to be better, and I think in Switzerland the diet's a lot better than what's eaten in North America, for example.
Yeah, because they're culturally in Switzerland, it's a mountain country, so they have a lot of cows. So
Yeah,
there is
exactly.
predominantly
Yeah.
milk or dairy and meat. Even though now they have their own agriculture and of course
Mm.
cereals and everything, but France now is they have all this processed food and everything, and people, the rural areas are not really rural anymore. The cereals industry is dominating so much. So
Yeah.
the ranchers, if we say it in English, most of them, they have now the beef, even in Switzerland, raised. The price raised 2 weeks ago. I went to my butcher and the price changed, and he said because they don't find,
Mm.
because production is lowering, because
Oh,
they make it so difficult for ranchers to survive. So
yeah.
whenever they let their land, who comes? Well, the cereals company come.
Yeah. Yeah.
They do. So it's a global phenomenon, I think.
Mm.
And I don't know your opinion. Do you have hope seeing all this social media about keto, carnivore, animal based? Do you think this will change the trend, as we saw like yesterday with the FDA?
Yeah, I
Or
think that's the only hope we have is Robert Kennedy in America.
okay,
He's promised to change things, and he's courageous. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, it's really interesting because 2014, Nina Teicholz, just as I was being charged, her book was published, Big Fat Surprise. And she then became one of my expert witnesses. And
okay,
she's now everyone's saying, gosh, you wrote this book 11 years ago and it was absolutely correct. And
mhm,
so there is change. I watched her this morning. She was doing an interview on one of the radio program or one of the TV programs in America. And she said, you don't understand how big this is because the dietary guidelines control what foods are provided to everyone in the US. The
mm.
old people, the schools, the military, the prisons, everything. So to make that change is enormous. Yeah.
I think there is a price to be ahead, and you are one of these people, I think.
Yeah.
So there
But
was a huh?
I was my son-in-law is a professional sports coach.
Uh-huh.
And we were chatting yesterday, and he has a problem that he's expecting his team to do poorly for 3 years and then to be the best.
Okay.
And he said, what do I do? Because I know this is the story and this is the reason. And the reason why it's going to happen is completely understandable. The funders are doing the right thing. But it's going to be 3 years of pain. He said, what do? I said, you tell the players, you tell the management the truth,
Yeah.
because then they can't come back at you.
Yeah.
And I gave him a great example. Early on in the vaccine story, they changed the definition of what is a vaccine. And I picked it up. And I wanted to irritate some of the vaccinologists in South Africa. So one of them, who receives hundreds of millions of rands from Bill Gates, I said, oh, but obviously you're not talking about the COVID vaccine because it's not a vaccine. And he fell for the bait completely. So he said, how can you give such an irresponsible tweet? Of course, we haven't changed the definitions of vaccines. And then he carried on. And so I said, but actually, here's the definition in the dictionary last year, and here it is now. You've changed it. You're fibbing. so we had a debate in the media, but it's on the internet. It's stored on the internet for life.
Okay.
2 days ago, Senator Johnson in the US Senate was speaking about the fact that they changed the definition of the vaccines, of what is a vaccine. And he said, this is what they did. So I could now say, well, in South Africa, sorry, I must say that the person who I was arguing with said you should go back to medical school and claim a rebate on your fees because they didn't teach you the right stuff. And that's all down on the internet. You can find it. So I drew attention. I said, in South Africa, if Johnson said that, he would have been told he had to go back to his university and claim his fees because he'd been told lies. So my point was, if you tell the truth, you don't have to come back and justify it 10 years later, because the truth is always there. Yeah.
All right. So it's been a real pleasure and honor for me to be able to discuss with you, Prof. Noakes. Great 90 minutes of information for the listeners. Hoping that this will help as much as possible, most people as possible as well. And I will put everything on the show note so people can find more information about your activities, the Noakes Foundation, the Nutrition Network, and the Eat Better for South Africa. In October, you're going to have the World Nutrition Summit in Cape Town as well. Yes.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that.
Yes, so I'll put also more information. Prof. Noakes, thank you very much for your presence on the podcast. I wish you the best.
Thank you, and you too, and thank you very much. I really enjoyed the time. It just flew by because you asked such intelligent questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Interviewing is an art, and you've got the art.
Thank you for your art.
Because when I speak, I don't have to worry about what's going to happen next, but you have to think, okay, how do I follow up, and when do I intervene, and when do I say this, and you did it brilliantly. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your encouragement. I'll try to continue. I try to choose on the podcast. I did the podcast because I lost the contract and I was attacked by saying, you're not a doctor, you're not a nutritionist. So I said, okay, fine, I'm not. I'm just a personal trainer and a massage therapist. But now I'm going to talk to people who are like doctors. So I'm not saying anything. I ask questions, you answer. Great. So thanks a lot. All the best.
And to you too.
Thank you, Prof. Noakes. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.